Welcome to the Leadercast podcast, a weekly deep dive into the stories that transformed our guests into leaders worth following. I'm your host, Joe Boyd. If you've been enjoying the podcast, thank you so much for being a listener. One simple thing you can do to help us out is give a review wherever you listen. Today's guest is our friend and Leadercast contributor, Todd Henry. He's the author of The Accidental Creative and several other best-selling books. In this episode, you will learn that Todd basically felt like he was growing up on Tatooine in Star Wars. We'll also talk about how leaders make a decision between trying to decide if something is doable hard or destructive hard, when to persevere and when not to. And you'll find out what concert he would go to if he could go to any concert in the world. Todd Henry, welcome to the Leadercast podcast. So happy you're here with us today, man.
Joe, it is so good to see. It's always good to see your smiling face, but it's always great to just get to chat with one of my favorite people.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying my face was smiling, because my wife's critique of the podcast has been that I don't smile enough. So,
it's funny. I don't know if you've had this experience as a public speaker. I mean, I speak obviously a lot in front of larger crowds, and it's easy to lock in on that person that looks like they're angry at you or looks like they're completely disengaged. But I've come to learn that usually, or not usually, but like more often than not, that person's just like really thinking and processing. Right. But like you internalize that as a communicator as like, that person hates me.
Right.
That person thinks I'm stupid, but it's like, they're just thinking, that's just kind of the way it is. And so because I've watched several of your interviews, I always interpret it as Joe is a deep thinker and he's right now processing and assimilating. There are all these algorithms going in your head right now.
Yeah. Right.
So
thank you. That's usually what's happening. And we're starting this off in an interesting way, but I the other thing is, once I'm friends with someone, they almost always say like a year or two later, I thought you hated me when I first met you. I'm like, what's wrong with my face? What am I doing? Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're talking about you. We obviously are friends. We've known each other a while, but you're also an amazing contributor on our platform and a main stage speaker at Leadercast. A ton of great videos. You've done a webinar for us. So thank you so much for being a part of our community and for helping our leaders out. And you know a bit about who we are and what we do for sure. For the podcast, I would love to just dive into Todd Henry and your story and what made you who you are. We kind of use the hero's journey as a motif for it as much as it works. Like we all have a desire to go on an adventure when we're younger somehow. And then that's rooted in something we need usually. And then a dragon comes along to try to stop us from getting what we want. There's usually a mentor that comes in to help us. And what I'm finding, the premise of this podcast has proven to be true so far, that usually we kind of get what we wanted, but in a very different way than we thought. So just kind of exploring that through everyone. So could you take me back?
That sounds like life.
Yeah, that's the way life works, right?
Right, yeah.
So I actually know a lot of your like story because we're friends, but I don't know much about your childhood at all. So what was little Todd like? What were you into? I love to ask what adventure stories were captivating you as a kid, or myths, or comic books, or anything. What were you into as a kid?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very rural part of Ohio. Literally lived in the middle of cornfields. So, our house was surrounded by cornfields. There was a cornfield they rotated crops. So sometimes it was soybeans, but backed up to my backyard. And so, imagine, basically being out in the middle of nowhere. It's the 80s, late 80s. We have no internet. You have to drive 45 minutes to go to a movie. You have to drive, 60 minutes to go to a mall. So we had to make up our own fun, at that point. So when I was young, I did all kinds of crazy things, we tried to turn a lawnmower engine into a helicopter. I tried to build a ruby rod laser in my garage. I probably would be on some kind of terrorist watch list today if they saw all the chemicals that I ordered from, caught my bedroom floor on fire doing chemistry experiments. But we just had to invent our own fun. We would go out in the woods and make movies with a video camera, which at the time, a video camera was like literally that giant suitcase that you had to carry on your shoulder, and you had like the shoulder mounted, camera. All in order to get like worse quality than you could probably get with your watch today, So it was a really fun, free form environment. And so, you ask about like mythical heroes or mythical characters growing up. Most people, when they think of Star Wars, they think of Yoda
Yeah.
or they think of Obi-Wan Kenobi. I think of Luke Skywalker. And
Yeah,
the
for
part of the
sure.
reason is like, here's this like kind of honestly like dumb kid from Tatooine who's kind of like, working on his aunt and uncle's, what, vapor farm or something, whatever.
Yeah.
And he's called to a greater adventure, even though he kind of grows up, in a corner of the universe that nobody really cared about.
Yeah.
And listen, I love where I grew up, but it was, I mean, kind of again, like kind of out in the middle of nowhere, right? Like not close to any cities or anything. And so I think I always sort of identified with Luke Skywalker in a way. I was like, I wonder what's out there. I wonder what might be possible if I were to go on some kind of a journey. And I think
Yeah.
that probably informed a lot of like the crazy stuff that we got into growing up. Some of the creative stuff that we did was just this idea of like, we can kind of make stuff and poke and prod at stuff and invent stuff and create stuff and kind of make our own fun. So
Yeah.
it was a really, I loved where I grew up, and I love the effect that it had on me because of that.
That's super interesting. Like your expertise is in creativity, especially as it merges with leadership. That's how I think of what you're an expert in. You can challenge me on that if you want. But so obviously you're creative even as a kid. Like as growing up, did you self sort of diagnose yourself as the creative one among your friends or a creative person when you were younger?
Ah, boy, that is a great question. I don't know that I ever intentionally would diagnose myself that way, but when I look back, the clues are all there, right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
I was really into magic when I was a kid, so when I was 6 years old, I saw believe
Nothing
it or
more cool than
not, Doug,
magic as a kid,
nothing more cool. Like,
especially with the
man,
ladies.
seriously,
Yeah.
like magicians, they are the cool kids in the class, right? Always.
So I'm interested when you were younger, like when your group of friends, did you sort of self-diagnose yourself as I'm the creative one, or did you figure that out as you went through life?
I don't think I ever really diagnosed myself that way. I don't think that's something I really thought of consciously. But when I go back and I look at my childhood, all the pieces were there, right? Like
Yeah.
when I was, maybe 6 years old, I saw a Doug Henning special on TV. Which, I mean, come on, that first of all, that'll date me how old I am. But
Yeah.
second of all, like who like calls like who would look back and say like Doug Henning was one of my creative heroes?
Yeah.
But he like sparked in me this sense of wonder for, wow, this guy's like, I don't know what he was doing, like pulling rainbow scarves out of his hand when
Right.
there was nothing there, whatever Doug Henning was doing. And it blew me away. And so I got really into magic and started learning like close-up magic and entertaining and stuff like that. And, that sort of led then to music. I discovered I had an aptitude for music when I was about 8 years old. I went to my aunt's house. She lived across the street. And I sat down and I just started playing a song that we were singing in music class that day. I'd never taken piano lessons. I'd
Yeah.
never played the piano before. I just sat down and started playing it. And they're like, maybe there's something here. And so I discovered I had an aptitude for music. And so I was kind of always the kid that was dabbling in, music I had the trifecta because I also dabbled in ventriloquism for a while, which is also the really, the coolest thing in the world. And so I kind of had this like kind of proclivity for all these like
Yeah.
weird creative things.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would, because I was also like an athlete. Like I played basketball and played football and played, all these sports growing up. So I never really thought of myself as like the creative
Yeah.
kid. But looking back, it makes total sense.
I'm fascinated with just ambition in general, and especially in the culture we live in. It's so many of the leaders that we sort of value, maybe overvalue, are the most ambitious ones. But we all have it when we're younger. When you think of that, maybe getting into middle school, high school, even college years, what was that ambition that was sort of driving you? Was there something calling to you to do something in the world? How would you have verbalized it early on?
Yeah, so I mentioned music before, and music was really kind of my first love
Yeah.
creatively. I was a songwriter and was really inspired by like kind of old school rockabilly 50s music, and that kind of led to becoming sort of like a singer-songwriter I don't even want to say country music vein, because country music kind of implies
a certain thing to people nowadays. They think
Mm-hmm.
of, sort of like pop country, bro country kind of thing.
Yeah.
But was really kind of writing more in that kind of Bakersfield, West Coast kind of rockabilly kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Um, and that was really my first love. And I actually played music through college. Got to play and actually make a living for a while as a traveling singer songwriter, which was a lot of fun, and got to open a bunch of shows for a bunch of big acts and kind of experience what that was like being the person that nobody really wanted to see on stage.
Yeah.
To kind of be the person who's like the person before the person. um, and so I have tremendous empathy when I go to a concert now and the opening act is on stage, and there are like 3,000 of us in the room, all of whom are like talking to each other or wandering into the room as the opening act is, playing their set. I totally, totally get what that feels like. But the beautiful thing about that, and it's when you look back at your life and you look back at your career, and I'm sure you feel the same way, and your leadership, honestly, um, nothing is wasted, but nothing really feels all that efficient, right? It's very rare that
Right.
it's a straight line to get you where you are, but everything in your life is useful in some capacity. And for me, having to go on stage in front of 3,000 people who are there to see Toby Keith, or who are there to see,
Yeah.
Dixie Chicks, or Kenny Chesney or somebody, and having to figure out a way to win them over,
Yep.
that was a really good experience for me, because in retrospect, that's what when I look at it now, that's what I do when I walk into a room of 3,000 people at a conference and they're like, maybe they know about one of my books, or maybe they've heard me, somehow on a podcast or something. They have no clue what I'm going to say, and I have to find a way to win them over. And that was a really good experience, going in front of essentially hostile audiences,
Right.
for all those years. So I look back on that now as a really, really wonderful experience. I don't think I would want to put myself back in those shoes again. I don't, I'm sort
I
of
was going to
glad
ask,
that
there's two,
I'm,
because I'm a recovering performer as well, right? So doing improv and comedy and acting, and uh, I think there's two kinds of us. There's the ones that are like felt like it was cut short a little, and secretly
mm,
would like to give it another couple of years to see what happens. And then there's also folks that are like, I totally got that out of my system. So do you have
yeah.
is there a little bit of your heart that's like, I might want to retire and go do that again? Is there anything left in there for the performer?
So it's interesting. So I recently gave a talk at Skirmerhorn Symphony Hall in Nashville,
Mm,
and the talk that I gave was about a concept that I've been working on in a book I'm writing right now about bravery. And one of the points in it is that sometimes you have to exercise bravery to move on. You have to have bravery to let go, which means you need people around you. And this is true of leadership too, right? You
yeah.
need people around you who are willing to tell you, listen, I know you think this is right. I know that you care about this. You put a lot of energy into it. It's time to just cut and move, right? Like cut the line and move, because this is not going anywhere. um, I was in a place where, and I'm sure you probably had the same experience, I was kind of perpetually on the edge of something happening,
Yep.
right? Like
Yep.
I had label reps coming
Yeah.
out to see me. They were all excited. I had managers who were very excited about what was going on. I was like kind of always on the verge. And some of the people that I was writing with and hanging out with back then have gone on to have phenomenal careers, in the industry. Um, but I had people around me who were like, hey, like you're a good songwriter. I think there's something better in you. I think there's something that you're capable of that maybe you don't even see in yourself yet. And I think maybe it's time for you to move on, to try
Mm,
something else.
yeah.
And I'm grateful for that. So I was giving this talk at Skirmerhorn Symphony Hall, and the strange irony of the whole thing is I gave my keynote, and I was setting up in the afternoon for a breakout, and all of a sudden I hear the song "The Dance" by Garth Brooks playing, it's kind of like wafting through the air. And
Mm,
I recognized that it was Tony Arata's version, who is the writer who wrote the song.
yeah.
And I thought somebody in the back of the room was playing it on Spotify or something. I thought it was like somebody was playing a
Yeah.
playlist. And I said, hey, who's playing Tony Arata's version of The Dance? And again, I was just like kind of hearing it wafting, right?
Right.
Like I could recognize it that clearly. And they're like, no, he's on main stage playing the song right now.
Yeah.
He had been the GM of the Bluebird. Erica Willem Nichols had invited him to come out and play that song as sort of like an illustration of the impact of the Bluebird Cafe in Nashville. And so I like dropped everything. I sprinted down to the auditorium, and I got the chance to meet Tony Arata and like have my picture taken with him. But for me, that was a really beautiful full circle moment.
Yeah.
Because it was this kind of realization that had I not had those people in my life at that moment in my life, I mean, who knows, maybe things would have worked out, or I might be right now, managing a retail store in Nashville, still trying to get a break as
Right.
a songwriter,
Yeah.
like you don't know. So I don't have any regrets about that. I think I'm grateful for the people in my life who spoke truth to me at a critical moment and encouraged me to pursue something more. And the truth is, we'll never know. We'll never know what might have happened. But
Right.
again, that's true of leadership. So when we think about leadership, not to like make it turn the corner here on to talk about leadership,
I was
but
gonna
when we
turn
think
it
of,
on you anyway. So yeah, go for it.
okay, great. So when we think about leadership, one of the things that leaders struggle with the most is just making a decision and moving on. Kierkegaard said that the thing about a decision is it parts fog on stagnant waters, at least for a while, right? I think that leaders, because they're not certain about their direction, they become really unclear. They're not willing to be clear about their thoughts, about their process, about their intentions, because they feel like they have to be certain it's the right decision before they make the decision. The reality is we're never certain. I mean, uncertainty is just the water that we swim in as leaders, but we have to be clear and we have to be willing to make decisions, because that lack of clarity trickles down to the entire organization. So for me, when I look back at those critical life moments, I'm not certain, or I wasn't certain at the time I was making the right decision, but I had a really clear sense of what I wanted to accomplish with my life. And I had other people around me who provided some clarity about what they saw in me. And that was enough for me to move on. That was enough for me to change the vector. And I'm super grateful that I did. It's been a long, as my friend Mitch Joel says, a long squiggly path. But
Yeah.
I think we just, we can't go back and change things. We just
No.
have to keep moving forward.
Well, yeah, I just have a follow to that, and I mean, maybe I'm trying to sneak some early excerpts out of your new book on bravery, but I think as a leader, I spend a ton of my energy trying to figure out, is this thing I'm leading people toward that's hard right now? Am I being called to perseverance, or is it hard because we need to do something different? You know what I mean? Do you?
Yeah.
That I feel like that's, I mean, in small and big ways, that's everyday leadership, is trying to figure out when, because there's all these great like mythic stories of persevering, right? I think that I feel like that sort of pressure to be the one who perseveres as a great leader, and we have the vision and everyone follow us, but sometimes it's just it's the wrong vision, and you gotta take the time to figure out where you actually need to go. Do you have any thoughts on trying to make that decision, like how to weigh between what's Bill Hybels used to do a talk on doable hard versus destructive hard? Like how do you weigh, like, is this doable or is it destructive to keep going? Drop some wisdom, Todd Henry.
That is a phenomenal question, and I think really it comes down to, at the end of the day, it comes down to not to sort of take the extrapolate to an like more existential level, but it comes down to the core why behind what you're doing, and also the definition of destructive, versus doable. There are missions that are worth pursuing in spite of the consequences, right? Because the stakes are so high and because the outcome is so important and so critical, so crucial. And there are some that you're doing because of ego. There are some that you're pursuing because you're not willing to admit that you're wrong. There are some that are the result of confident adaptability. I have a vision and I'm willing to pursue that vision, but I'm also willing to listen to disconfirming information and adapt and shape my vision as necessary, and to let go, because there is, to some degree, there is some point at which you arrive where you have to say, okay, no matter what I do, the cost of getting there is never going to be worth what we achieve when we finally get there.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what you have to do, there's a concept in childhood development called brachiation, right? It's the principle of, I have to learn how to let go of one thing while simultaneously grasping onto another. So think about like a child on monkey bars, right? Mm-hmm. You're swinging from bar to bar to bar. The child has to learn how to let go of the bar they're holding on to, maybe even before they fully grasped onto the next bar. If you don't, what happens? You get stuck.
Yeah.
You stall your momentum. And when that happens, you fall, which is ironically the very thing that you're afraid of, which is why you don't let go. You're afraid of falling, so you don't let go. But the ironic thing is, if you don't let go, you fall. That's what happens. So I would argue to you that sometimes leaders who look like they're moving in a bullheaded manner toward an objective, the question isn't, the question really is, am I really making progress, or am I afraid to let go of something? And if I'm afraid to let go of it, why am I afraid to let go of it? Am I actually moving towards something? Is there really a vision I'm pursuing, or is it just something that I'm afraid to let go of because I don't want to admit I'm wrong, because I don't want everybody else to think that I had the wrong vision initially? And I think that's a question only the leader can answer at the end of the day. But it's one that we often don't ask. We're afraid to ask. I believe we're more defined often by the questions we avoid than by the questions we ask as leaders. There's an exercise I do with leaders often. It's called defining question. What is your defining question right now? The question upon which everything else hinges. Often we ignore those defining questions because of the implications of answering them. When we answer that question, suddenly we're accountable. When you ask a question and you arrive at an answer, then you're accountable for what that answer, for executing that answer, or for the results of having asked the question. So we'd rather just avoid it. We'd rather not ask the question and just pretend like things are fine and keep moving forward, because we don't want to deal with the consequences of answering that question. And so,
are there common
there's
questions?
No simple way to.
Are there common questions that, when you ask leaders that, are there common questions that tend to come up that most leaders are avoiding, or is it kind of all across?
No, I think it's going to be highly individual to every leader, right? It's usually very situational. Often it's something like something with one of their direct reports that they know for a fact is toxic to the organization, but they carry a big load, right? They have broad shoulders, and they're afraid of what might happen if they let them go. I work with a lot of creative organizations, and often that particular example has a lot to do with maybe like a creative diva within the organization, where they're the sort of the genius with 1,000 hands, as Jim Collins would call it. But the reality is the entire organization is now set up around serving that genius's whims and wishes and needs and emotional insecurity and whatever. And it's destroying the entire organization in the process. But they're afraid to address that, or to ask that question, what would life look like without this person? Because they're afraid of the implications of that. What's that going to mean? And so it's going to be highly individual for each person, each leader. But I think it's a great exercise to go through. What is my defining question? What do I deeply suspect to be true, but I'm not willing to admit yet? Right? Like those are really great questions to ask.
That's phenomenal. And sometimes I forget people actually listen to these conversations. Like take a moment here and ask yourself that question, right? Pause it. There are those, and it just takes someone like you giving the prompts of like things we know we probably should be asking or dealing with, but so much of life we just kind of sleepwalk through it a bit, or maybe we're afraid to ask it, right? So just getting back to your story a little bit, I'm curious. So I know you'd spent time as a creative director, and then basically went out on your own, right, as an author, speaker, consultant. Has that been maybe 10 years that you've done that?
Wow. 12, 13 years.
13 years. That's a long time. So that obviously was another moment in your life where you said, I'm doing something good, but I'm going to go do something else. I'm curious, in the last 13 years, you've had bestsellers and have had a ton of influence in the world, and could rattle off all the amazing people that have brought you in to consult with. But we talked about being able to let something kind of die or let something go. In just the last 13 years, have you had any ideas or books or anything that you're like, this is it, and then had to face that moment yourself where you're like, oh, this isn't it. I need to not do this. Any moments like that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. 100%. Okay. So my first book was The Accidental Creative. As you know well, like there's no telling whether a book's going to do well, whether it's not. You can suspect, but you just don't know unless you're like somebody who sells hundreds of thousands of copies out of the gate every single time. You just don't know. The Accidental Creative did really well, which meant I got to write a second book, which was amazing. And I wrote that book, and it's ironic. I was just today rereading some journal entries from 10 years ago when I was in the middle of writing that book. And it's
which book was that?
And it was Die Empty. It was my second book. And as I was writing that book, my thought process was, I think I'm choking. I don't think this book is any good. I don't know if I have anything to, it's funny in retrospect, I look back on it, and for most people, that has been the most influential book I wrote was Die Empty on their personal journey. But for me, as I was writing it, I was asking all these questions and doubting, and I don't know, and I don't know if this is is any good. But that book did really well out of the gate. So now I've got 2 books I've written. I basically wrote and published 2 books. They both did really well out of the gate. Die Empty was like one of the books of the year on Amazon. It was like #1 audiobook in the world. I'm like, this book thing is easy, right?
Right.
You just write a book, you put it out, everybody buys it. It's great. So I went about writing my 3rd book, which is called Louder Than Words. And it was about finding your unique leadership voice, or finding your voice in the marketplace. And I think to this day, it might be maybe the best book that I've written, just from a pure writing standpoint. So I put it out, and it landed with a thud. Like, it sold fine, right? Like a handful of 1,000 copies or something the first couple of weeks. But it kind of landed with a thud compared to the other ones. It just stopped selling after the first couple of weeks. And I started panicking, and I reached out to a mentor from afar, somebody who's been influential in my life, Seth Godin. And I asked him, hey, what should I do about this? And he's like, the marketplace is almost always stupid when you launch something. The marketplace doesn't know what it wants, right? Like, you have to give it time to find its legs. And that calmed me down a little bit, but the book sales never really got back to where I wanted them to be. So that was disappointing. I mean, that felt like a massive failure to me. And that was in 2016. Now, the final part of that story is this: of all of the books that I've written, that book specifically is the book that people reach out to me about the most, who are either already very, very successful at what they do, and they found it incredibly refreshing for them as leaders. And I'm talking about people who, if I were to mention their names, people listening would know who these people are, have reached out to me and have said that book was incredibly influential on their life and really changed the way that they were approaching their work. And what I realized is that I thought I was writing a book to everyone. My audience was basically, all of the creative professionals that I serve. And what I realized was I was probably just writing a book to a select group of highly accomplished leaders who really needed to hear what I had to say. And in retrospect, I look at it and I'm like, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. It did its job. It found its audience. It just wasn't the audience I thought it was going to be. But still, to this day, it's my worst selling book of all the books I've written. But it's probably maybe had more influence on the world because of the people it actually reached, right? And so that's, you think you're doing one thing, and sometimes you accomplish something very different than what you think you're setting out to accomplish.
Yeah, that's so good, man. And then it was Herding Cats, your next book?
Herding Tigers.
Herding Tigers, So it's been interesting to watch you navigate that journey. And it's very much like, it's not that different than wanting to be a musician, like a lot of people want to be authors for a living. You gotta do a ton of work and figure it out and have a little luck, but your stuff has just been so instrumental to me. And it's just, I know, when I tell people that we're buddies, people will immediately mention one of your books and how it affected them. So
that's cool.
It's good to know that you're doing that work, and I think it's always hard to measure success. Is such a weird thing to try to measure, so it's easy to measure. Like, the easiest way to measure it is to try to reduce it to dollars or people. And that's important in many ways. But like you said, oftentimes I try to measure success in stories. And so when you start hearing those stories back, even if it's the one that maybe you didn't make the most dollars on or sell the most copies, you start to realize this played its purpose. That's been true in my life for sure.
Yeah, well, I'm a big believer that how you define greatness defines you in so many ways, and it's true as leaders as well. And we have to understand what we're really chasing. what is it we're really trying to do? I have a list of things I call the main things. I review it every single morning. I'm not going to share what they are because they're very personal.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, none of those things have anything to do with how much money I'm making or what my net worth is or how many books I sell. But all of those things are fueled by the money I make, or they're fueled by, how many books I sell, and that's fine. But that's not what I'm measuring. What I'm measuring is this select group of things. And I look at them every morning and ask, are all these things still true? And if they're all still true, I'm like, okay, everything's great. Whatever happens, happens. I'm going to work as hard as I can and control what I can control and not worry about the stuff I can't. I'm just going to do my best to have a positive influence within my sphere of influence and not worry about my circle of concern where it's outside my influence. To quote Stephen Covey. And I think that's a really helpful thing for me, just to have that core set of ethics or that core set of circumstances I monitor every day.
Yeah.
Because listen, leadership is tumultuous. It's unpredictable. Things are going to happen. You can be on the highest high one day and the lowest low the next day because of things that are purely out of your control. And so you have to have some set of grounding principles, some set of sort of a refining set of items that you look at and say, are all these things true? If they're all true, everything is good. I still have a compass in my hand. I've got the wind at my back. Everything's still good, no matter what's going on in the world around me.
Awesome, man. So try to end this with like a serious question and hopefully a fun one. I got to think through them a little bit as we go. But I think the serious one I wanted to ask, and you may have talked about this some here on Leadercast now, but people are listening to this, watching this. They're leaders. They have people reporting up to them. They're on their commute. They're going to go to work in the morning. You know what I mean? Like this is like real life. And there's probably someone that they lead that they would say that person is a creative person. And a lot of folks, I think, have that person, but they're not necessarily in a traditional creative field. And so yes. What is your best advice? And let's assume they're not a bad performer. They're not annoying. You just kind of know they have more in them creatively. What's your advice to lead someone like that for their benefit, but also for the organization?
Yeah. So first of all, I would frame it up by saying creativity is problem solving. So if you're solving problems every day, that means you're creative, right? And you're privy to all these same pressures that I talk about when I talk about designers and writers. I mean, you're problem solving, you're creative.
Yep.
The two things that every talented problem solving creative person needs from you as a leader is, number one, they need stability from you, which means they need clarity of process, clarity of expectations. They need to make sure that the rules of the game aren't shifting midway through the project, but that they can pretty predictably allocate their resources, their focus and their time and their energy, knowing that you're not going to shift things up a week and a half from now because you suddenly have a wild idea and now everything has changed and let's go back and redo everything we've already done, right? People can't function that way. Eventually they will just say, all right, I'm just going to wait for you to tell me what to do. I'm not going to put any energy or thought into this until you just tell me what to do, because that's what's going to happen anyway in the end.
Yeah.
So they need stability. The second thing they need is challenge. They want to be pushed. They want to try new things. They want to be given some leeway, not complete freedom. Complete freedom is not helpful to the creative process, but they want to have bounded autonomy, freedom within limits.
Okay. Yeah.
To try things, to take risks, to develop themselves, to venture into uncharted waters. But they need your permission to do that. They need you pushing them to do that. So my advice is, where there is dysfunction on your team, or where you're experiencing interpersonal conflict with someone on your team, or you're seeing somebody underperforming, it's often the case that they're missing either the level of stability that they need, meaning they're not getting the clarity of process and expectations and all of those things from you, or they feel stuck, they feel stagnant. And so they feel like they have to push against boundaries or question everything because they're not getting that anywhere. They're not getting that sense of risk and adventure and thought anywhere. Instead, they feel like they have to push against the things you ask them to do because that's their way of achieving that. So I would encourage you to ask, is there a place where this person is missing some level of stability or some level of challenge? And understand that that's going to be different for every person on your team. Yeah. So what works for one person may not work for another. Somebody else needs way more stability than the person next to them. That's fine. That's just who they are. That's what they require from you. And you need to be ready to provide it for them.
Love it. You're always ready, man. You always have the answer. That's what you're fun to talk to.
I've done this a couple times. I've talked about this just a little bit. Yeah.
All right. I don't think you've been asked this question. You can go back in time to any concert that's ever happened in the history of the world, and you can take 2 friends with you. What are you going, and who are you taking with you?
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. Any concert ever in the history of the world.
It can be a honky tonk with nobody there, but where are you going?
Man, that is really hard. It's really hard to turn down. It's really hard to turn down Woodstock. I mean, it just is.
Yeah.
Like, that is the iconic music event, right? I mean, so I would, I mean, not to be 100% cliche, but I'm going to say Woodstock, because how can you turn down Woodstock?
This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. You don't want to ruin it. You don't want to ruin it by being cool.
And people, yeah, and people are still to this day still talking about how unbelievable that concert was, and the experience and everything that happened, and the camaraderie, and just we're just going to show up in the middle of nowhere and have a show. Like, now, by the way, I want to be really clear. I'm talking about Woodstock 69, not Woodstock 99, which is a very different phenomenon, or whatever year that was. I think it was 99, where they had the, whatever. But yeah, I mean, that was, how can you?
Yeah. Okay. So 2 friends, who's going with you?
Oh, I'm taking you, of course.
Well, sure. Because we're best.
Come on, I'm inviting you. And I'm probably inviting my friend Tim, who is a huge music fan. I think he would probably really enjoy that. I mean, I would take my sons, actually, but if I'm inviting 2 friends, because I have 2 sons who are both really into music, but if I'm inviting 2 friends who are not family members, it would be you, and I would invite my friend Tim.
Thanks, Todd. I appreciate it. Man, this was awesome. You're the best. Ton of great content. And where's the best place for folks to go if they want to get one of your books or learn more about you?
Yeah, toddhenry.com is my website. My books are available wherever you buy books. Listen to the Accidental and Creative Podcast since 2005. We've been doing a weekly show on the Accidental and Creative Podcast, and just released a new episode yesterday. So, yeah.
Love it. Thanks, man. We'll talk to you again soon.